The important thing that I think refugee history shows is that refugees are a structural feature of the nation-state system. The modern nation-state system produces mass displacement. That's where we need to be seeking solutions, not seeking solutions for individual groups of refugees, because there'll always be other groups of refugees in the nation-state system. If we completely comprehensively overhaul the global political order, then we might have some hope of resolving what has been termed since the 1920s, when the nation-state started to become the only internationally legitimate state form, we've been calling the refugee problem.
You're listening to Across Archives, a space that highlights storytelling projects, archives, and oral histories that share the experiences of migrants, immigrants, internally displaced people, and refugees around the world. Here, we explore a wider community of storytellers, archivists, advocates, and scholars whose work inspires our own at the Refugee Archive.
Welcome to Across Archives. I am Pia from the Refugee Archive, and I am joined today by Benjamin Thomas White from the University of Glasgow. Thank you for being here. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and what led you into the world of refugee archiving and research?
Yeah, hi, Pia. Thank you for the invitation to come and speak today. I'm a Middle East historian by background. I did my PhD in Middle Eastern history, working on the French mandate in Syria. So the period of French rule in Syria between the wars, when the modern state of Syria emerged from what had been part of the Ottoman Empire. And in the course of my research, I registered that there were a very large number of refugees in Syria at that point. This is before the start of the Syrian civil war. So I was doing research in Syria in the period of relative political liberalization between about 2000 and 2010. And so I was researching the 1920s and 30s and realizing that in Syria at that time, perhaps somewhere between 5 and 10% of the total population were refugees. By some descriptions, people who had quite recently been displaced from elsewhere in the Middle East. Not refugees quite in the modern legal definition, if only because the borders that they crossed formed around them as they crossed them. But refugees weren't the focus of my research for my PhD and couldn't easily be brought into it. And so I just set aside that this was an interesting topic that I'd like to know more about and finished my PhD, which turned into my first and so far only book. And then I had an idea that I'd have a second research project on refugees and state formation in the interwar Middle East. The problem was that in the 2000s, and no doubt one of the reasons I'd got interested in this had been because of the importance of refugees in Syria while I was living there off and on in the 2000s, obviously a long-standing Palestinian refugee population, but also large number of Iraqi refugees who came into the country following the American invasion and occupation and the instability that unleashed. Also, between two trips that I made to Syria, a sudden influx of tens of thousands of Lebanese refugees following one of the Israeli attacks on Lebanon in 2006. No doubt this influenced the interest I had in refugee history of the region. But I was interested in studying refugees and state formation in the Middle East in the interwar period when the League of Nations was this international actor which had been involved in overseeing the French mandate. And that was what I'd written my PhD about, and was also involved in assisting refugees, including people who were in Syria in the 20s and 30s. The problem was that it was already somewhat difficult to do research in the countries I was interested in, which included Iraq, which was very unstable through the 2000s. And then by the time I'd finished the book of my PhD and was ready to move on to this, it was 2011. And I hadn't been back to Syria since I was doing my PhD research in 2007. And I just got a small travel grant to go and do some more research in Syria to start this new project when the civil unrest that turned into the war broke out. And within a couple of weeks of getting the email from the funder saying I could have £800 sterling to go to Syria, I got another email saying, but please don't go to Syria. And so I turned that research into research in other archives about refugees in the Middle East. And I started to work on that. I started to write articles about this. But it was not possible for me to go and do research in the countries that I was most interested in, Iraq and Syria. In the meantime, I got a job, having been a doctoral researcher, then a postdoc. I'd got a permanent job. I was starting to teach. And for my background reading for my project on refugees in the Middle East, I'd started teaching refugee history more generally. And as time went by and it became difficult for me to go and do research I'd want to do in Syria, and Syria became one of the world's top exporting countries of refugees, one of the world's top producers of refugees, having historically for a long period from the late Ottoman decades into the 2000s been a major host country of refugees. Now it was sending millions of refugees abroad. Increasingly, I got interested in refugee history in the world at large. And that, as well as guiding my own research, introduced me to a network of people in many different countries working on refugee history, and also to this website that existed called refugee.org, which was set up in the mid-2010s by two academics who were then both at the University of East Anglia in England, Lindsay Stonebridge and Becky Taylor. And a bit later, I would end up being involved as one of the editors of refugeehistory.org. But this was the research trajectory that brought me into refugee history. Involved doing research in archives in Britain and in France, whereas previously I'd done research in archives in Syria as well as in France. Also brought me quickly into conversations with people working to support refugees here in Glasgow, where I moved in 2013, 2014, and of course with people who are refugees themselves. And one of the things that had really struck me as I was doing research on refugee history topics is the way, more than was the case, for example, with colonized subjects in French Mandate Syria, the voices of refugees themselves were often excluded from the archives in really interesting ways and very revealing ways, I think. So the French colonial archives for the French Mandate in Syria, although they were structured by the colonial power and were organized in the interests of the colonial power, were full of documents that had been sent to the French by Syrians living under French rule, petitions, letters, all sorts of things. Whereas when I moved within the same archives to look at how French officials in the 20s and 30s had tried to manage displaced populations who'd come into Syria during the First World War, all were coming in as the state took shape in the 20s and 30s, I found it was much less likely that their voices, so to speak, would be in the archive in any direct way. So I got very interested in questions around the archive and refugee voices as well.
I see. You have mentioned that you were researching about refugees in Syria before the Syrian civil war. Would
Yeah.
you like to expound on how has it evolved, maybe archive wise? Were there more oral histories? How has the research evolved over the years? Can you expound
Yeah.
on what you have learned about how the camps have evolved and the research as well?
I can, probably at too great length. So to say your first question, first, you asked about how my research has developed in refugee
Yes.
history and whether I've used oral history, for example. And
Yeah.
for more recent periods, oral history is a really important aspect of research on refugees' experiences. My friend Catherine McKinnon, who I know initially through the refugee support sector here in Glasgow, it has for the last few years been doing a PhD with me on oral histories of refugee lives in Scotland since the 1970s, for example, and is doing some really interesting work around how to do oral history research when you're working with people for whom the standard oral history interview is inappropriate. For example, because it too closely reproduces repeated hostile interviews that a person has gone through as they make their way through the asylum process, say. So I think oral history is really important in contemporary refugee history. But my research has always been on this period that's just falling out beyond the scope of living memory. So even in the 2000s, when I was doing my PhD, I was working on the 1920s and 30s. And though I did talk to people in Syria, for example, who had been children in the 1930s and had some memories of, say, political mobilization, because school children were increasingly highly politically mobilized in Syria, really much of the history I was interested in, even in 2003, 2004, was already going back beyond the scope of oral history. And it was taking place in parts of the world which, because of what happened then and since, were less likely to have had the resources to institutionalize oral history practices and archive oral history interviews. So there weren't archives of interviews recorded earlier that I could draw on. So oral history is really important, but it hasn't been something that I can use so far for my own research on refugees in the Middle East. I have also done a lot of research on the history of refugee camps, and this has been a perennial theme. I've written quite a few pieces about this. I did have a plan to write a book about the global history of the refugee camp, which various things, including the requirements of academic career and a global pandemic and family responsibilities, seem to have put on hold indefinitely. But this is one of the things that I got interested in when I realized I couldn't do the project I wanted to do on refugees and state formation in the interwar Middle East. I anyway realized, as I was teaching refugee history, at a point when the field was emerging really and developing and taking shape, I realized that there was an awful lot of social science research on refugee camps around the world. But I had a sense that there wasn't enough historical work, and that because of the history of social science disciplines themselves, refugee camps, as we would understand them, already existed and were widely used, not just in the Middle East, but in other parts of the world, long before the Second World War. Less than 20 years earlier, in Cuba and in South Africa, the Spanish and British empires had interned civilian populations in camps. The civilians were in a good state of health when they went into the camps, and rapidly sanitary catastrophe and mass death followed. Whereas for the camp that I did a lot of research on in Baquba in British-occupied Mesopotamia near Baghdad at the tail end of the First World War, about 50,000 people who were in a terrible state of health were shepherded in to a large refugee camp that the British Army had built, and their state of health immediately began to improve. And their death rate immediately began to fall. For me, that's where the modern refugee camp comes from. And it's already global, because you have a camp that is being funded directly by the UK War Office, which means it's also being funded not just by the British taxpayer, but by American loans. There's an American humanitarian organization in the camp disbursing large sums of money that have been raised from American charitable giving. And the supplies for the camp are also global. Firewood, for example, is being shipped in from India. And so you can easily see several continents being drawn in to this one camp, and the refugees in the camp, who are mostly Middle Eastern Christians of several different groups, also have global networks in diasporas in the Americas, in the Russian Empire, and elsewhere, which they're able to mobilize in order to find their own ways, in some cases, out of the camp.
I want to go back to your work as well. You have shared interesting, very fascinating insights. What is one historical insight that you would say you would wish more people would understood more about refugees in general and refugee history?
There are quite a lot that I would need to pick among, but one of them is discussion of refugee issues in public and policy debates in many countries around the world treats displaced population, refugees, as though they're a kind of problem to be solved. And that also feeds over into fields of practice, in humanitarian practice, in human rights practice to assist people in claiming their convention rights, and in more kind of what you might term social work practice, for example, to deliver programs to assist, welfare programs to assist displaced populations. And also into quite a lot of academic research on refugees, this tendency to treat displacement as a problem and refugees as like an anomaly that needs to be a problem that needs to be solved, an anomaly that needs to be fixed by integrating refugees within the nation state system, reintegrating them in some way. And that's what the three famous durable solutions of the refugee regime of repatriation, resettlement, or integration seek to do. The important thing that I think refugee history shows is that refugees are a structural feature of the nation state system. The modern nation state system, which is a relatively recent historical phenomenon, produces displacement, produces mass displacement. I think it's important to recognize that. And that's why it's the one thing that I guess I would most want people to get, the one thing I most try and communicate in my senior honors history class on refugee history, for example, because then we understand a fundamental truth about the nation state system. And that is the issue. That's where we need to be seeking solutions, not seeking solutions for individual groups of refugees, because there'll always be other groups of refugees in the nation state system. Whereas if we completely comprehensively overhaul the global political order, then we might have some hope of resolving what has been termed since the 1920s, when the nation state started to become the only internationally legitimate state form, we've been calling the refugee problem.
Tell me about your work in refugeehistory.org.
I encountered refugeehistory.org as I was starting to do academic research on refugee history, and particularly as I was starting to get to a point where I was writing things, publishing things about refugee history, which took a long time for various reasons. And I immediately thought it was a really wonderful enterprise because I was aware that I was working in what was an emerging subfield of history, refugee history, where there was a lot of really interesting work being done. And academic research doesn't easily get out to wider publics unless we make a real effort to do that and find good venues for it. And that's what the website had been set up to do, as I say, by my colleagues Lindsay Stonebridge and Becky Taylor, who were then at the University of East Anglia. Becky still works there. And so I published a few blog posts with refugee history that related to aspects of my research. And I really liked it because, as well as doing things like doing a kind of summary of an article that had just come out or whatever, it was also a really interesting place to write more spontaneous pieces or to try out ideas that would help guide me into new research. And it was doing that for other people as well. And then at a certain point during the pandemic, which was also the first year of my first child's life, and therefore a pretty odd and busy time for me, I noticed that the site appeared to have gone offline. And I knew that Lindsay Stonebridge had moved from the University of East Anglia to a different institution. And I reached out to find out what had happened. And Becky Taylor explained that just with everything that was happening and with Lindsay moving to a different institution, the site hadn't been updated recently, but that she was very keen to keep it going. So I joined as one of the editors of the site. And I was lead editor for 4 years from 2020 to 2024. And then I am still on the editorial group now, and the editors have changed quite a bit in that time. And we have editors from other institutions, other countries. And the site has also tried to broaden its global coverage. Becky and Lindsay were both focused on refugees and statelessness in Britain and in European contexts, whereas I was coming in from a Middle Eastern perspective. And so we've tried to broaden our coverage, not just in terms of the history, but also in terms of why the history is being written and who it's being written by. Refugee history, like refugee studies more generally, is institutionally concentrated in the global north. Even though now, unlike the mid-20th century, now the large majority of people living as refugees are in the global south. And there have been initiatives we've been able to connect with that have enabled us to publish pieces by researchers who are based in the global south, including some people with lived experience of being refugees. But it is always difficult to do that because institutionally, as I say, refugee studies, refugee history, they're concentrated in the global north. It's easier, for example, for us to bring in scholars based in Canada or the US as members of the editorial group than it is for us to bring in scholars based in sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle East. That said, I know that we have a global readership in refugeehistory.org. On the one hand, Anglophone countries, the US, the UK, and then Canada and Australia are all high up in our top 10 countries for where our readers come from. But also in the top 10, for example, are India, the Philippines. And I was looking not that long ago in the analytics section of the, like under the bonnet of the website, and we have had readers from most of the countries in the world. And that's really good and is something that I would really like to see us reflect more in our content, and not just in the histories we write about, but also where those histories are written from. I'm really proud of quite a few of the articles, but also some of them are from before my time, like the Ria Sunga's article. Statistically, the most read articles on the site are by people named Ria Kapoor, a colleague who is now based at Queen Mary, University of London, wrote an article that related to her PhD research and before her first book came out on making refugees in India, which is also a much read article. While I've been involved in the site, one that I'm particularly proud of is by a Norwegian researcher named Charlotte Lisa, which is a brief history of refugees in Saudi Arabia. And I'm particularly proud of that because in quite a lot of the literature, particularly like the public and policy literature about Syrian refugees, there are a lot of comments about how, well, the Saudis should be paying for this. These refugees are Arabs and the Saudis, they're wealthy and all of that. They should be doing something. And then they're just writing a few checks. They're not taking people in or whatever, which misses a point that better informed observers like Charlotte had recognized, which is that Saudi Arabia, also not a signatory to the Refugee Convention, not keen to become a signatory to it, but had nonetheless historically taken in several large groups of refugees, typically by granting them position as labor migrants, Palestinians, Yemenis, Rohingya, and others, and was doing this with Syrians as well, that there were a large number of Syrians after the start of the civil war who were working in Saudi Arabia and whose wages in Saudi Arabia were allowing them to assist people who were living as refugees, but perhaps not in camps elsewhere in the Middle East. Charlotte had done this research, which later turned into a long and really useful article in Refugee Survey Quarterly, which is a history of how Saudi Arabia has managed refugees. And what I really like about the blog post that she wrote is that, first of all, that it set out this history in a way that there wasn't scholarly literature on this. And because of the absence of scholarly literature on it, there were quite a lot of misconceptions and false claims or misguided claims being made about Saudi Arabia as an actor in the refugee regime. And also, this is a case where Charlotte wrote that blog post for us and then wrote an academic article that expanded the ideas at length. And that's really interesting for me because as an academic and as someone who tries to assist students and assist doctoral supervisees and so on in developing their writing practice, I also like to encourage people to think about things like blogs as a place where they can test out ideas and then take those ideas forward, rather than seeing blogs as a place where you summarize the research that you've done in your academic article, and that the blog can help you develop your academic research rather than being a thing that you tag on afterwards. So that would be a reason why I'm particularly happy with that one. And it shows that the absence of scholarly literature on that particular topic really shows, because that quickly became another of our most read articles, which shows that when people tried to find out about Saudi Arabia and its refugee history, one of the first things that they would find was this blog post by Charlotte Lisa, because it was the only available good piece of historical writing that was out there. Now, more of her full-length publications are out, which is great, but you could immediately see the need for that piece of writing. But I'm happy with quite a lot of the things we've published. And with mine, in the same kind of way of using the blog post as a less formal writing that can allow you to develop your ideas. Before I was involved as an editor with Refugee History, I published a couple of more reflective pieces that were based on visits I'd made to sites rather than on archival research. So I wrote a couple of pieces that were helpful for me for thinking through these places. One about Rive, which was a site in the southwest of France that was built as an army transit camp in 1938 for colonial troops, but before it was occupied by the army, was used to house Spanish Republican refugees in 1939, and then housed a rapid succession of different displaced and otherwise mobile populations, before more recently in the 21st century becoming the site of a memorial museum. And so I wrote a piece about a visit to that site. I also wrote a piece about visiting, not going into, but visiting the outside of an Australian immigration detention centre when I was in Australia on a fellowship in 2017. The Villawood Immigration Detention Centre, which housed different mobile populations. The detention centre at Villawood in the western suburbs of Sydney was built on the site of a migrant hostel from the period of state-supported migration to Australia after the Second World War, being built on the site of a munitions factory that had operated during the Second World War. And that's a history that is shared by quite a number of sites in different Australian cities. So it was really interesting to write a bit about that. After I became involved in editing refugee history, I also wrote a speculative piece when a comment from a friend, Laura Madakuro, a Canadian historian who's now more recently joined us as one of the editors. I actually just went and looked at the footnotes to the document UNHCR keeps on its website, listing states parties to the 1951 Refugee Convention. And the footnotes tell you when a state signed up to the convention, and if it was before 1967, whether it signed up to the convention, placing a limitation on it so it only referred to European refugees, or without that limitation, so it could refer to refugees from anywhere. The academic literature in refugee studies largely assumes that the 1951 convention was geographically limited, and that limitation stayed in place until 1967 when it was lifted. But actually going through the footnotes and seeing when different states signed up to the convention in the 50s and early 60s, and what they said about how they would choose to apply it, I discovered that from the start, more signatory states chose not to apply the geographical limitation. And this tied in with what other researchers had told me about what they knew about global South states being involved in shaping the convention in the debates between 1948 and 51. The 1951 Refugee Convention and the refugee regime that emerged out of it, which we're still living with today, was more global from the start. It was less Eurocentric than is often assumed. And while I think it's worth thinking about it as Eurocentric, I think it is easily overstated. Like, that's just assumed rather than properly tested. And I think that is worth exploring. And that blog post allowed me to think about that. And then from there, influenced some later research I did as well.
Where can we see more of your work? Are these in the refugeehistory.org?
Yeah, that blog post is on refugeehistory.org. You can just look for posts that were written by me, although I strongly encourage you to look for posts written by other people as well. The research that pushed me towards, the most substantial publication that's come out of that is co-authored with my friend Malika Rahal, who is a historian of modern and contemporary Algeria. And we co-authored an article in the Journal of Global History that came out in 2022 about UNHCR and the Algerian War of Independence and the role the Algerian War of Independence played in the globalization of the refugee regime a decade before the 1967 protocol. And we used that to argue that the international refugee regime became a site where newly independent states in the global South could articulate their own post-colonial sovereignty. That article is open access, so it's available for anyone to read. If you fancy reading a full-length academic article, it's in the Journal of Global History. Yeah, so you could, if you're interested in that, there you go.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing about the refugee history. Thank you for joining us and for the work you do. It's really fascinating. Thank you so
Cool.
much.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Across Archives, a project by the Refugee Archive. Our conversations here highlight the storytellers, archivists, and advocates who are shaping how migration and displacement are remembered. If you'd like to go deeper and hear the voices of women living these experiences firsthand, join us on The Archive Speaks, our oral history audio archive, featuring powerful stories from female-headed households and single mothers in displacement around the world. Together, Across Archives and the Archive Speaks preserve memory, amplify unheard voices, and reshape how we understand the experience of displacement. Listen to the Archive Speaks wherever you get your podcasts, or visit the Refugee Archive to explore both projects and learn more about our work.